Welcome back to Thriving in Business and Life. This is Will Wilkinson.
And this is Christopher Harding, and we're going to hop, Will, from the topic we covered last week, which was the genius of inclusion and how to leverage people's abilities, into something that's directly related, and that is a process we call quantum responsibility.
Term that I love.
Yeah, so we want to cover that because, as you know, we often encounter people, and it can happen to us as well, where we get confused about what is responsibility and what is accountability. And
yeah, well, we were going to define that a little more today, and it's not semantics. It's significant what these differences are.
Yeah, so the vital difference, we say, between responsibility and accountability is that responsibility really is a mindset. Mm-hmm. And we're tapping into the work of Dr. William Guillory, who we've kind of utilized his process for quite some time in coaching and so on, that the idea being that if I walk around seeing myself as responsible for the choices I make and the consequences those choices create, how I show up in life is very different than if I see myself as not connected, to that responsibility.
Well, absolutely. It is a mindset which takes the negotiating out of the picture.
Say it now. Tell me more about that.
Well, it's not about figuring out how responsible I am, how responsible you are, how we're divvying it up. It's much simpler, and as we say, it's more the thriving way to live and work, to just assume responsibility. I am responsible.
Right. Yeah, I'm responsible for how I show up, for my role, etc. And in our book, Thriving in Business and Life, we have a quote by Dr. Milton Erickson where he talks about that many people walk around in what he calls a trance of disempowerment. And since he was the father of hypnotherapy, he knew a fair bit about trance induction.
I've heard some amazing stories about work by skilled therapists who were able, sometimes using very unusual methods, to jolt people out of their trance. And they all agree that, regardless of the techniques you use, it is kind of like waking up.
Well, and you think about it. We've talked about it before, that we all generate stories about who we are in a particular situation, who we are in life. And so the real question is, since we're making up stories all the time anyway, what we're suggesting is that we create a story about our empowerment, about our responsibility, and that if we're going to be in a trance, it might as well be a trance of empowerment rather than disempowerment.
Be in an empowered trance. Well, and there's levels. It's not like we're in a trance and suddenly we're out of it.
Right.
I think any of us who really start paying attention to this discover, probably to our surprise, that waking up isn't a one-time deal. We wake up to some level, and then we wake up to another level, and there's always more to go in really assuming full responsibility for our lives.
Well, and one of the things we've talked about in nearly every practice we recommend is that one of the ingredients is accountability partners.
Right.
Somebody who can help us say, hey, the way you just showed up, here's what I saw it creating. And my job is to go, wow, thanks for looking out for me. And then I take action to straighten that out if I went awry.
Well, I've personally benefited from this for literally decades because I've worked with a men's movement, the Mankind Project, 70,000 graduates around the world. And one of the techniques we use, we call the stretch, where in a meeting, if a man, decides he's going to commit to do something, that's his stretch. And then he'll ask someone to be his accountability partner, which means that the next time they get together, that guy's going to say, so, last week you said you were going to do this, that, the other thing. How did that go? Now, just the fact of knowing that somebody is going to hold you accountable tends to be quite a motivator.
Well, absolutely, and that's why we recommend peer coaching in a business environment, because if I've partnered up with somebody like that and I'm working through a challenge, I've maybe got a difficult relationship at work that I'm dealing with, if I've got somebody who's following up with me and really challenging me to be my best self in those situations, I'm far more likely to. And then, and we don't want to get into this because every time we have a conversation about responsibility in a training or coaching session, people a lot of times get confused between responsibility and blame.
Right, and we talk about the blame game, which actually could probably be a pretty popular show on TV.
Well, as you know, once upon a time, myself and my colleagues created a whole pilot for a game called the Blame Game, and one of our writers happened to leak that really wonderful idea to his fellow Saturday Night Live writers. They created several skits for several weeks parodying the yet-to-be-aired show, and it basically killed the deal.
Right, and so you blamed him. He leaked the secret.
That was our initial reaction. We were creating a game called the Blame Game to point out the idiocracy, you could say, of blaming. And the first thing we did was started blaming him. And then, fortunately, we recognized how absolutely kind of funny that was.
Well, actually, it could make another good show. Behind the Blame Game.
Yeah, so one of the things we describe, as you know, is that when blame comes up in the conversation, actually what's happening is it's an attempt for people to hide from responsibility.
Right, pointing the finger, and of course there's three fingers pointing back at yourself. I want to look at the other side of this, though, for a moment, because when we talk about the blame game, this is kind of where we go. First off, the other side of it is we're not suggesting anybody gets a free pass. I mean, accountability is shared. I assume responsibility for myself. That doesn't mean ignoring someone else's accountability and responsibility.
Well, and that sometimes is the toughest job for a leader, a manager, a supervisor, is holding other people accountable and being willing to have the uncomfortable conversation that says, hey, listen, here's what we were looking for. Here's what the outcome was. Can you help me understand what went wrong?
Right. Well, just going back to my experience with being held accountable by friends, it's interesting to notice how many lessons can be learned when you blow it. I mean, I've been in situations where my accountability buddy will say, so, Will, last week you said you were going to do this, that, and the other thing. How did that go? And I've had to say, oh, you know what, I forgot. And because we have an agreement not to blame each other for what happens, you're mutually agreed to learn from whatever occurs, my buddy would usually say something like, oh, you forgot. Now, is that something that happens a lot in your life? And then I get to reflect on, why did I forget? It wasn't a priority. I said it was, but it actually wasn't. So there's a lot to be learned, even when things go off the rails.
Well, I think especially when things go off the rails. And in talking with executives regularly, they'll share with me in coaching that they see themselves and their people learn far more when something goes wrong if they don't play the blame game, and if they share. Sometimes they'll say mutual responsibility, and so I'll say, well, tell me what you mean by mutual responsibility. And they say, well, we're all responsible. And I say, and so what does that look like?
Right.
And what they're kind of thinking in their head as they describe it to me is there's this single responsibility scale, and all of us have some portion of that, meaning, we're at 20 and 15 and 30%. Nobody's being fully responsible.
Yeah.
So quantum responsibility, this is kind of that exponential leap, is when we introduce the idea that there are multiple scales of responsibility, and we each have our own 100% for how we show up. And that doesn't take anything away from the other person's.
Well, we play with this, in the book, also in the course, posing a scenario where things went off the rails, and then inviting the person who's doing the program, reading the book, to assess responsibility in the team. And that's what happens. They divvy it up and come up with 100 as a total. And then the punchline to this, and it's brilliant, is that, well, actually everybody has their own power scale. Everybody has their own 100% responsibility.
Right, and so some of the things we've done to try to help people understand, well, what does 100% look like? So we say, well, you have a mindset of being the owner of what you create in life, but we've also listed some behaviors in our power scale that are kind of on the disempowered or, barely surviving side, or on the more empowered, thriving side. And so if we just run a few of those, we've just been talking about blame.
Right, and on the other side of that, obviously, is taking ownership.
Right. The one side would be making excuses.
And the other is what we just spoke about, learning lessons.
Yeah. And I had somebody make an interesting distinction the other day. They said, what's the difference between reasons and excuses?
That's a great question.
Yeah, and I said, well, it depends on what you're using those reasons for. If you're using those reasons to learn lessons and to better assess what happened, then that could be really powerful. If you're using those reasons to then make excuses,
right. That's like a defensive posture.
Right. So, another behavior that can show up on the disempowered or surviving side is that I become defensive.
Right, defensive and reactive rather than proactive. I think this is a huge one. I notice that almost everybody is too busy. And so you introduce the idea of being proactive rather than reactive, and it's like, I don't think I have time for that. But if we're always putting out fires, we're not really making any progress. We're just living in a fire-free zone. That's not really accomplishing anything.
That's right. Well, I had somebody ask the question the other day in a session I was in, and they were making a point, and they said, a lot of times we talk about being too busy, and they said, what I think that is a failure to have created a strong enough vision with appropriate priorities so that we know what to say yes to and what to say no to. And this is also part of ownership and responsibility, right? If I have a vision, am I making choices that are actually going to contribute to where I want to head, or like you said, am I merely in reaction mode?
Yeah, and a friend told me something years ago I've never forgotten. It's so simple, but you hear it and you go, oh, right. He said, whenever you say yes to one thing, you're saying no to something else.
Yeah.
And at the time, that was a real revelation, because I was kind of in the mode of, well, I can pretty much say yes to everything if I want to. No. There's a subtraction that occurs. I'm over here, I can't also be over there.
Well, until we learn how to bilocate and be in multiple places at one time.
We're working on that. Stay tuned.
So one of the other things that shows up regularly on the kind of, you could say, surviving side of the scale or disempowered side is where we let bias cycles prevail. They are biases, we don't pay attention to them, and we act them out, and we don't really take ownership for doing anything about them.
Well, and this is where skills matter. And we do need these skills if we're in any kind of a leadership position and if we're working with teams, because the momentum can often ride the biases. So let's say in a group discussion, you're working on some issue. Well, the biases show up as a suppressor of divergent views.
Right.
And the skilled facilitator, and I've witnessed people doing this, once in a while I've had the foresight to do it myself, will interject and say, Brian, you seem to indicate you had a different perspective on this. Could you say more about that? And I've seen that occur where it just brought everything to a standstill because there was so much momentum going in the biased direction. And this was being ignored over here. And when that divergent view was included, the whole picture opened up.
Yeah, that's, we've talked last program about inclusion, and what you just described, of course, is one of those skills and steps involved in being inclusive and seeking intentionally and seeking inclusive views. We talk about this in a blog, actually, that just went up this morning about how really denial can show up when we become so intense about our version of the vision and goal that we shut down and aren't willing to seek out opposing views, when the smartest thing to do would be to talk to people we think will disagree with us and find out why.
Well, that's the mature approach. I think all of us can realize that at times we do get so seduced by what it is we're in love with. As a writer, I notice this with certain phraseology. I just love something I've written. And my wife is a tremendous truth teller, and I'll show her this. And I'll read the paragraph, in the book I'm working on, an article, and she'll say, well, I liked everything except that one phrase. I'll say, not that phrase. It's my favorite. But that's got to go, because I have my blinders on. There's something about it that's intoxicated me, and I can't really see it through a reader's eyes, which is the point. I'm writing for them, not myself.
Right. Well, as we move on this power scale here, what are the behaviors we can do to really help ourselves actually show up more responsibly? And on one side of the scale is where I become very problem-centric. I become mired down in the problems. I know you introduced kind of this idea to me first that it's kind of a problem-solution paradigm.
Right.
And then that means that in order for me to justify my existence, I have to keep finding problems.
Well, absolutely. That old phrase comes to mind, if you think you're a hammer, everything looks like a nail.
Right.
And when we're seeking out problems, when we have the identity of a problem solver, we will find problems to solve. It's like editing. When you're editing work, if you hired an editor and he said, well, it looks good to me, you wouldn't think he was doing his job. So he's got to find some problems to fix.
Right. And that's, that's always the case. I mean, if we hand something to somebody, we should expect feedback. But the other flip side of that is somebody who's solution-centric. Mm-hmm. And I was just coaching somebody the other day, and they'd been told by their person up the line from them, look, I appreciate the fact that you can identify problems. What I want you to bring me are solutions.
Yeah.
And so look at it from a solution-centered viewpoint. Right.
Well, I've been in conversations where whoever was facilitating would give a guideline, something like, all views are welcome, you can have a contrary opinion, and connect it to something constructive. You can be negative about what someone else is suggesting, but give a little thought to an alternative.
Yeah, and that there's. I was just thinking to my own reaction of what you just said. I mean, I like that personally. Mm-hmm. I'm just also aware that sometimes somebody is aware of a problem and they don't yet have a solution.
Mm-hmm. Right.
So I want to give them the freedom to bring that up as one of the divergent views.
Yeah. Without needing to package it with a solution. I get it. I agree.
But part of it is, I mean, we see this a lot. We can get into it ourselves, where I become mired in the problem mindset and become not even open to solutions that might work.
Yeah, and we don't want to infer in any way that we're not taking problems seriously. In fact, someone with a solution-centered mindset is keenly interested in the problems. I mean, they need solving, but they're coming from a different level. One of the terms we use to engage the imagination is what if. Use that phrase to open up the field of possibilities that is closed when we're just overwhelmed with the problem itself.
Well, and like, what if there was a way of solving this that we haven't even thought of yet? Mm-hmm. I mean, even something as simple as that starts to open up the mind to, there are ways to come about this. And the next couple of things on the power scale, on one side is closed-minded, the other one is open-minded. Yeah. The one is, and this kind of goes with the closed-minded problem-centric, as I then focus on pointing out people's mistakes and what's wrong. And a lot of times a leader or a manager can start micromanaging people to the extent to where they actually thwart their enthusiasm.
Yeah. It's called raining on your parade. Nobody likes that. You're reminding me of a really hilarious episode with Tony Robbins, the giant motivational speaker.
Right.
My wife and I lived in Hawaii for years, and we attended quite a few of his events. And he was making this very point during one of his seminars, and there's like 2,000 people in a big ballroom. And he said, look, start with something positive. When you give somebody feedback, look for something you can say that's encouraging and supportive, and then bring in the constructive feedback after. He said, so we're going to try this out now. I'd like to invite anybody in the room here to make a comment, and then I'm going to invite somebody to respond and give us their feedback on the comment. So some woman put up her hand, she made a comment, and some guy put up his hand, he was going to respond. He said, well, she didn't really speak loud enough. I couldn't hear her, so she should talk louder. And Tony picked up a bazooka-sized water gun and leapt off the stage, ran to this guy and soaked him from head to foot. And he got back on the stage and said, okay, let's try that again. Now, it's very simple. Start with something positive and then get to the negative. I'm not exaggerating. 3 people repeated the mistake. And the last person he had to chase down the aisle out of the ballroom. So this is a real problem. We are very much centered in, critical commentary. And it seems like a simple enough technique. Just start with something positive, but the programming runs really deep.
It does, and it's interesting. To me, that's one of the signs of a trance of disempowerment.
Right.
Right. I can't even get my head wrapped around looking for something positive. I remember coaching a couple of leaders in an organization, and I was espousing this very point that you just made, and about catching them doing it right.
Yeah.
And he said, so what you're telling me then is I'm supposed to give people praise and acknowledgement for doing their job. And I said, I am saying that, yes. And he said, why would I do that? I'll give them praise if they do something extraordinary, but why give them praise for just doing their job? That's what they're paid for. Mm-hmm. I said, well, the simple answer is because it works.
Yes.
And let me tell you why. And I went on to explain the brain science behind positive feedback and how it actually, allows the body to, do dopamine shots to the brain, which forge new neural pathways to reinforce that behavior that he just acknowledged, especially if it's authentic acknowledgement. And it took these 2 guys a while to put it into practice because they were so ensconced in I will only praise you if you do something that in my estimation is excellent.
I've heard the argument against praising people for so-called doing their jobs. It goes something like, well, they're supposed to be doing it. Why would I praise them? And if I do praise them, then they'll start looking for praise. They'll be expecting it, and they won't do their job unless they get praised. And that's just flatly wrong.
Well, the research shows that it is wrong. People basically...
But that is the argument. I've heard it a number of times.
Well, you notice there's a real mistrust in that whole concept, right? That people are only going to do their job if I'm watching over them like a hawk. There was actually a whole philosophy in management school years back that basically espoused the belief that people are lazy by nature and don't want to work and will only work if we're holding a club over their head, basically.
Well, and this gets us into unhealthy competition, which is on our list on the surviving side. And I couldn't help but think of that classic film, Glengarry Glen Ross.
Right,
with the team of real estate agents competing for, sales.
Right.
And just how brutal that was because the low men on the totem pole were going to get fired.
Well, and that has been a popular belief. The main thing what we're encouraging on this is, take responsibility for how you show up.
Right.
And to know, based on modern brain science that's just really been evolved over the last decade based on live MRIs, we can see that people function at a far higher level if we can create a positive, reinforcing environment that both acknowledges their progress, holds them accountable for doing great, as well as holding them accountable for when things don't go well, and then we start to coach them and help them hold themselves accountable.
Well, let's talk a little bit about the alternative to unhealthy competition, which is healthy collaboration. Because there's something about competition that can be very healthy. My wife and I were out bowling. We go bowling about once every 10 years. And all the women were bowling in one part and all the guys were over here. And my wife wandered over and said, it's really boring over there. We're not even keeping score. And she said, can I play with you guys? And we were competing. We definitely wanted to win, but it was a friendly kind of competition. We were really collaborating, supporting each other. She had a lot more fun with us. So there is a place for healthy competition when it's collaboration.
Well, and that's the thing. I mean, and that's why we say, unhealthy competition, because competition can be really useful, especially, like you said, when we're all in it together. I think collaboration is something that we very often don't know how to do too well in our culture. So that is a process of how do you create it, and it really goes to one of the last things on the list, creating a win-win-win environment versus a win-lose environment.
Well, I think it's fair to say that we're kind of swimming upstream on this one, because you just look at the conventions in our culture. The NBA Finals were just on, and definitely one team won and another team lost. They didn't both win.
Well, and part of that is, though, in sports and in certain competitions, we're not suggesting that everybody gets a trophy. That is just practical in that type of a situation. What win-win-win means is that when I examine a situation and how I'm going to show up, I ask myself several questions. Is this going to be truly good for me in the long run? Mm-hmm. Is it going to be good for my people, whether that be my family, my team, etc.? Is it going to be good for the organization? Is it going to be good for the overall climate of our industry? In other words, seeing competitors purely as competitors means that I will run them into the ground, which sometimes actually backfires on us terribly. So, win-win-win. Is there a way that I can act honorably and healthfully in such a way that it isn't win-lose? Yes, I might come out healthy and strong. I might be the industry leader, but I'm not doing it in such a way that I'm creating destructive chaos behind me.
Well, it's a very wise viewpoint, actually, because we don't know how things are going to develop. Down the road, we may find that someone, an individual or another organization that was our competitor actually begins to become our collaborator.
Well,
and so if we've built good faith with them, if we've treated them fairly and looked out for their welfare as well, that could pay off big dividends down the road.
Well, right. We can really help each other out versus having people who are out to get us because we've been so unscrupulous or harsh in the way we've treated them. That was my sales mentor when I was in sales early on in my career, where he said, we don't have competitors, we have collaborators in serving the customers. And sometimes,
what a great viewpoint.
It completely revolutionized how we were able to grow as a company because we espoused that view and acted that way.
I'm just remembering a story about some department store, I'm not sure which one it was, that a customer came in to return an item, and actually it wasn't from their store.
Right.
And they took it back.
Well,
they worked out the details with the other store just because they wanted to serve the customer. That's an interesting collaborative model.
I worked in a store when I was going to college that basically had the philosophy the customer is always right, and they never questioned returns. Now, we had some people in the store, it was quite a high-end store, that were quite wealthy individuals in the community, and they would, for example, maybe a woman would come in and say, I want to try this dress at home. She would then wear it out to a party that night and bring it back the next day, right? Now, we knew that because some people had actually seen her wearing it. We never questioned it. We always, catered to it. Now, first of all, they did buy a lot of things from us, but they also talked us up to everyone.
Right. I mean, what are they going to say about your store when they're treated like that? And what's that worth?
Yeah. So the whole idea, kind of in a nutshell here as we close up, take responsibility for ourselves, for how we show up and for the ripple effect it creates, and realize that we each have the opportunity to be more powerful by taking our 100% responsibility scale and making the most of it.
Right, and quantum responsibility inspires others, and I'm sure we all know people who've demonstrated the attitude we've been detailing on today's show, and if they've really inspired us, then probably the best thanks we can give them is to join them with that attitude and do the same so we can inspire others.
Right. So if you have your own stories about power and responsibility, you can email us at thrivinginbusinessandlife@gmail.com. I'm Christopher Harding.
I'm Will Wilkinson. We'll see you again next week.